That takes us to item number 6.1, which is the forensic audit report with a presentation from BDO Canada. And we will hear from Jervis Rodriguez, who's partner, and Simon Paget, Director of Forensic Disputes and Investigations. Mr. Hildebrand.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. Just my opening comments. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay on Zoom? Great. So good afternoon. Thank you for being here today as we provide you with a summary from the BDO forensic audit. As Chair Gillis said, Jervis Rodriguez and Simon Paget are with us from BDO Canada and will be taking us through a PowerPoint presentation that summarizes the key findings from their investigation. Before we get started today, I wanted to take a moment and just explain what a forensic audit is. A forensic audit is much more specific and detailed than a yearly external audit that all local governments are subject to. A forensic audit is typically used to uncover misconduct or inappropriate behavior, up to and including fraud. They examine financial records, gather and analyze evidence, and potentially could be used in court. The purpose is much more targeted at very specific issues. They conduct interviews with key individuals, uncover evidence of or pertaining to fraud. Examples could include expense fraud, procurement fraud, bribery, or corruption. They are significantly more detailed in the review of samples. And then finally, a forensic audit is often considered a critical independent process to ensure allegations are taken seriously and to restore trust in an organization and the public. Thank you to Ms. Campbell, our corporate officer, and Ms. Soltis, my executive assistant, for their tireless work in providing the necessary details and information to BDO. Thank you to our managers and finance team for providing the data that we were looking for throughout this lengthy investigation. And most importantly, thank you to our staff, both past and present, as well as contractors and partners that provided key information to the BDO team. My next comments are something that I feel very strongly about, as I, along with Randy Deal, the previous interim CAO, have witnessed firsthand through this investigation. This is a very difficult and emotional experience for many of our staff, and it is important that the board fully understands the impact. This investigation will reveal significant gaps in policy, procedures, process, and practices, and how they were exploited, with no concerted effort to identify them or make the changes necessary to eliminate them. Our staff deserve better. Our staff deserve to be heard, secure in the knowledge that they will be listened to, that they will feel safe at work, and that appropriate actions and/or changes will be made as a result. We are also fully aware that the fact that the residents and taxpayers of the TNRD deserve better. Having seen the detailed audit, we know that we have a lot of work ahead of us to regain their trust. That work has already started and will continue for as long as necessary. It is certainly my opinion that we fully accept the conclusions of this audit and the mistakes that were made over years leading to this point. I also strongly feel that the TNRD should accept and own all recommendations made by BDO Canada, and more importantly, that the entire organization moves forward with continued implementation of policies and best practices that will benefit the TNRD as a whole and the constituents it represents. Of course, I will leave this critical decision to the board and will take your direction. As you will see, BDO will be identifying key areas of control weakness that the TNRD need to address, and this will be my focus moving forward. I will be developing a strategy on how we effectively and efficiently undertake these important recommendations in a way that is both timely and meaningful. You can expect updates on our progress. The TNRD has promised a fulsome and transparent report of these findings. When the process started, we hoped it would be at the first public meeting after the report was delivered. This is the first time we have ever dealt with such a report, and our lawyers have advised that a full copy of the auditor's report cannot be made public at this time, as a legal review is needed to ensure that we are not releasing any information that we are legally prohibited from disclosing. In hindsight, I wanted to point out that I made a comment last week that was printed in the Kamloops newspaper yesterday that was accurate at the time, but unfortunately changed thereafter. This is extremely disappointing to me, but the nature of a forensic audit report means that it is highly sensitive and confidential documents, and we must do our legal due diligence. A copy of the BDO summary that is being presented at this meeting will be released today, and the full report of the auditor's findings will be released as soon as they are made available to us. We are determined to prioritize delivery of the forensic audit findings. We are committed to the public accountability and transparency, and we will work as quickly as possible to ensure that the findings of the report are released to the extent that we are able to, bearing in mind our legal obligations under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And finally, having supported BDO and their work in the investigation over the last 9 months and the significant time and effort that this forensic audit has taken, I can honestly say I'm very frustrated with our inability to release a fulsome report today. But I also recognize there are legal implications, and I thank the public for their patience and understanding as we work through that. I would now like to pass it over to BDO's forensic audit team to take you through the presentation. I think Jervis is going to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hilbrand. And thank you, Chair Gillis, for this opportunity to present at least what I think will be a summary of our findings and some of our recommendations for the purposes of your consideration, the board, as well as for the community and the benefit of the community. So it goes without saying, a forensic audit is a very lengthy, extensive process that is typically conducted by experts with a background in forensic and investigative accounting. And our expert in this case happens to be Simon Paget, who will be going through the body of the report. But before I pass it on to Simon, I did want to echo some of the comments that perhaps Mr. Hildebrand has already talked about, and that being the nature, scope, and challenge of this investigation. Let me leave you with a few important comments around the extensive amount of work that has been conducted, both at the end of TNRD and staff at TNRD, as well as at our end, BDO, the forensic accountant. It's been a challenging review and assessment, an extensive review extension and assessment, but a comprehensive review too. And I think what you will see is this engagement for us started sometime back in April of 2020. And over the 8 or 9 months, there's been thousands and thousands of documents that we've had to look at, thousands of emails that we've had to look at, expense reports that we've had to look at, and lots of other documentation along the way. Somewhere midstream through the exercise, our scope of our review was expanded from a expense review to include also a review of some of the procurement practices and some of the contract practices at TNRD. So over the 8 or 9 months, there's been, in terms of time and effort from our end, well over 1,500 hours that has been expended in terms of trying to get to some of the facts, as well as trying to get to some of the findings that you will hear about through this exercise. As Mr. Hildebrand said, for legal reasons, we are restricted at this point in time to release our entire report to the public. And similarly to TNRD, I think we are also disappointed that the wholesome report isn't made public at this point in time. But I am confident it will eventually be released once all the lawyers have reviewed the contents and the form of the report. Let me assure you, though, that does not take away from what you will see and hear today. I think there's some very important information that you will see and hear today that will give you a very good idea as to the nature and the scope and the extent of our review that has been conducted. We do have a number of recommendations that we have concluded on, summarized, and you will hear many of those today. And both Simon and myself will deliver some of those recommendations at the back end. But with that introduction, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Simon Paget, who has led this engagement from the start. And he will now go through some of our slide presentation information. Simon?
Yeah, thank you, Jervis. Thank you, Scott. And very importantly, Merry Christmas to everybody. And I hope also that we all find some calm in the next year. I'm just going to share my screen with you guys. Okay. So this is the results of the special forensic review into the expenses and procurement review. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. Table of contents, we're going to talk about, first of all, the scope of the work we've done, a massive amount of information and documentation we've looked at, and the time period. Then we're going to look at the summary of observations, and we'll be finalizing the discussion with our recommendations. So let's get straight into this. The scope of our work with regard to phase one, first of all, which of course was the expenses of management and the board. So we collected and reviewed, originally extracting somewhere over 45,000 pieces of information. And that was narrowed down by keyword searching and review to substantially looking at 12,000 documents. We also reviewed all of the related policies and bylaws relating to what we're looking at and the code of conduct. It was over 12, it's 12 to 13 documents. We extracted and reviewed information from the SOFI reports. That's the statement of financial information. You'll see some of those extractions. The expense reimbursement, you just move, Zoom's very good at putting photographs of everybody in front of the writing. Expense reimbursements and per diem reviews. We reviewed 876 management and 264 board expenses. The expense reports and the documents as well attached to, in quite a lot of those situations, there are many invoices and receipts attached. As you'll see in quite a few of the documents, there weren't. We also reviewed about 75% of the 7 members of management, and 25% of the expense documents relating to the board, and 100% of the former CAO's expenses. And then we did our drafting and review and editing the reports. This is phase one scope. The period of the review was, of course, 2015 to 2019, that 5-year period. Phase two related to the procurement activities. The procurement and vendor review, as we call it. We reviewed several projects. The former CAO's per diem analysis. Excuse me, telecommunications expenses. That particularly relates to where the telecommunication equipment was not at any TNRD premises. It was at individuals' premises. Investigative due diligence work, something we do in all our investigations. This relates to background searches and trying to find out background information. Prepared and conducted over 20 interviews. Investigation reports. One was anonymized, one was a full report, so actually 2 versions of that. Recommendations reports, which we'll go through later. And generally, meetings, discussions, correspondence with TNRD management, employees, external parties. We have to prepare work plans for everything we do, manage our project. Travel to Kamloops, I must say, was very limited. We're very cost conscious on that because we are, of course, in Vancouver and we all have electronic equipment now. So we only visited at the very early stages to gather information and also to conduct some interviews effectively, I think, last week. BDO quality review, very important to us. And there were some other additional requests, which I'm just going to quickly summarize now. We were asked during our investigation scope to look at a couple of other things, or one or two other things. Review of an event where there were some concerns. The per diem analysis, which was actually for a 6-year period. We did some work on that. The telecommunications previously discussed, that was additional work. I guess you can say this is why a lot of this wasn't presented at the last board meeting. Conducted additional interviews. Many of these interviews we didn't decide to do till later on as information became apparent to us. Most of the interviews were a lot longer than we budgeted for. People were very willing to stay longer and talk to us in more depth. Additional targeted email review, investigative due diligence, extra checks that we needed to do. The anonymizing the report did actually take a lot of time and effort because of the many annexures and attached documents that needed to be sanitized or anonymized, and board presentations and attending these meetings. So that's a list of the scope of the work. Let me get straight into some of the findings of this investigation. So, as I said, we looked at some SOFI reports to try and get some comparatives of some of the numbers we were looking at with comparative regions and municipalities. This one here is on the CAO remuneration. And you can see from the key at the bottom that the red is the TNRD. The other colours are other averages of other municipalities. Which ones did we choose? We chose ones with similar asset bases, similar asset values in balance sheets, similar revenue streams, and also the bottom one of the blue one is the neighbouring and similar geographical areas. So we can see straight away from these charts over the 5-year period that the red bar is specifically higher than the others consistently. The red is the CAO expenses of TNRD. In particular, 2017, the red bar is substantially higher. There is a reason for that. There was some overtime in there for one of the emergency operations. So summary of that slide is comparatively speaking, CAO remuneration and overtime significantly higher at TNRD. Similarly, we thought it'd be interesting to do a comparison of the expenses of the CAO, the former CAO. On this chart, it's blue. We just like to change our colors randomly. The blue TNRD CAO expenses, we can see are significantly higher than the other similar municipalities in the region. We also looked at, in our analysis of expenses, food and beverage vendors. And this is a review of the total amounts, dollar amounts spent at particular vendors and numbers of visits also. So we can see on the left-hand side over the 5-year period, Nandy's at the top was a spend of 26,000. Then Terra, then Dorian, and we go down the list. We just categorized ranked the top 10 in terms of the dollar value spent during each year. On the right-hand side is the number of visits, and you can see the number of visits more frequent to coffee shops, so Cafe Motivo, Hotel 540 at the top. I think one of the things that stands out to me is the fact that Nandy's is the biggest spend on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, it's not the larger for numbers of visits. So the implication there may be that smaller numbers of visits, but larger values of each visit. And then we looked at these expense approvals processes, and we selected samples of expenses as mentioned earlier. We actually reviewed $755,000 worth of expense reimbursements in our sample. And we can see in those grey circles that $197,000 did not have itemized receipts as support. So it was 26% in our sample over the 5 years. 13,000 had no approvals, a very small percentage. On the approvals, just to put it a little bit of context there, we see on the right-hand side that the former CAO approved $503,000 or 67% of those sampled expenses. And the CFO approved $669,000 or 89% of the sampled expenses. So the reason that's mentioned there is that these two positions are very highly involved in the approvals process of the expenses, and in particular the expenses that we reviewed. We wanted to touch base on Barefoot Bistro simply because this has been significantly looked at by the public in the press. We did have a look at this. The amount expense at Barefoot Bistro was $8,600. The anomaly here, or the unusual thing here, is that the total amount of this bill was split into two transactions under the direction of the former CAO. So most of the bill was paid at the event, and an element of the bill, I think around 20% of it, was paid the next day by somebody else. Very highly unusual, not the normal way that we pay expenses in our employment. Individuals who attended were not listed. Again, this is something we would have expected, particularly for such a large event. And again, later on in our recommendations, this will be in there. We do expect listings of individuals. And in effect, there were some handwritten notes on these receipts, but they were kind of illegible and maybe indicating charge to general ledger codes, which is quite unusual. Usually the postings go to the cash book for reimbursement. So we don't understand why the illegibility, why there were no more details on these receipts. And there were no actual detailed itemized receipts. Of course, in a lot of these situations, the receipts are the credit card total amount being paid, not the detailed receipts. Meal expenses above threshold were a concern to us. So the bylaws and the policies do have thresholds, maximum amounts to be expended on meals. And we can see for each year, there are quite substantial numbers and dollar values of receipts in our sample selected that were actually above these thresholds. Top 5 food and beverage vendors. So Nandy's, as we recollect, was number 1 in terms of the dollar value. So we did an in-depth look at this in terms of Nandy's and the fact that no itemized receipts were quite often the case. So of the $27,000 expended at Nandy's over the 5-year period, 25,500 of that was represented receipts with no itemization, no packing, no details of what was spent, whether there was alcohol or not, whether there were starters, mains. And that represented 94% of the value of that expenditure, which is pretty high, as you can imagine. 90% of the numbers of visits did not have itemized receipts. Secondly, Terra. We looked at Terra restaurants. Similarly, of the 20,000 spent at Terra over the period, 18,600 did not have itemized receipts, 90%, or 60% of the visits. We looked at Dorian Greek restaurant. Again, 80% of the value spent there, no itemized receipts. And Hotel 540, 76% without itemized receipts. The last one, I think, the K, is a small number of attendances because, and I wanted to show you this because it's 100%. Only 8 times were the visits, very infrequently. $7,000, so on average you can see that that's close to $1,000 a visit. So these are quite expensive meals and 0 itemized receipts. Gift cards were also a concern to us. So this very quickly shows us that we noticed 62 gift card transactions and our sample reviewed. $6,400 was the value of those gift cards from 27 vendors. We did see gas station gift cards significantly, 25 of those at $50. You know, whereas the other problematic expenditures, there are policies in place which are weak and have gaps in. There appears to be no policy relating to gift cards. So we'll see that again later in the recommendations. When we started to look at phase 2, we did several vendor reviews or procurement activity reviews, or you might want to call them tender reviews. These are reviews of not individuals' expenses, but the expenses of the TNRD itself, and they were quite substantial. We pulled the general ledgers for these expenses and selected large contracts. For example, one of them was the contract for your atrium at your head office there, which was in one particular year, I believe, about $1 million or just over $1 million. NNH contracting, that's just an example, but we looked at several vendor reviews. The concerns as to why we looked at them, well, we are aware there's a tendering process and policy which does state anything over $75,000 should be considered to go through a tender process. We wanted to check compliance with that. We were also made aware, and we hear concerns about the former CAO's relationships with certain vendors, and we wanted to check the reasonableness of those expenses. So, of course, if we look at the observations, we did see examples of cost overruns. The nature of the expenses were in some areas quite unique. There were anomalies in the nature of the expenses, whereby you know, expenses on telecommunications, the addresses on those invoices were individuals' home addresses, TNRD employees' home addresses, not the head office expenses or anywhere that we would have thought you would have internet connections or telephones. The RFP processes, we did see examples whereby these were not being followed, particularly with regard to the $75,000 requirement to go through a formalized tender process. We saw examples of that not being followed. The frequency of meals relating to these particular vendors. I think if we talk about Nandy's again, very frequent meals relating to large expense pockets in your general ledger. And a lot of the interviews that we did, many people did talk to us about, we must look at these procurement activities. There were very many concerns surrounding this. And then we move on to the former CAO's expenses, where obviously a lot of the concerns were originally raised. This was the reason, I think, for the initial phase 1, the initial engagement. So just to run through some of those observations, we did see all over the place inconsistencies and incomplete information in terms of invoices submitted, whether names are being listed on receipts. There was just no standard pattern of the events. And of course, policies and procedures are designed to bring about a standard process for everybody to follow. We saw, just going down the bullets now, second one, insufficient documentation in many examples. Of course, mainly the receipts. Splitting of expenses, we saw this as quite an anomaly and an unusual situation. We saw several examples of bills being split, dining, restaurants, food and beverage outlets, whereby several people would be attending, and they were directed by the former CAO to use their individual credit cards this time. Next time it would be somebody else. Charging expenses to general ledger codes, which is quite unusual. You know, maybe in our mind could be to try and camouflage or highlight the amounts and where they're being posted. false listing of employees on those receipts or credit card receipts. So there was usually a list of employees attending. We did find out through the interview process and subsequent statements received that many of those employees say that they did not attend those events. We got several examples of that. So why employees would be listed by the former CAO when they weren't in attendance. It is an anomaly. Missing itemized receipts, again, meals allocated to the former CAO is higher than the per diem threshold. We saw several examples of that. There was certainly a pattern of that. One of the extra pieces of work that we did look at was the Japan trip, and we noted some claims, per diem claims during the former CEO's personal days off, for which meals were being charged. And so that needs to be looked at into a little bit more depth. Meals with unspecified non-TNRD individuals were quite prevalent as well. Yes, we saw those in the vendors we looked at. We also saw those with regard to vendors that we didn't look at. So a summary of the overall observations, just an opening paragraph there with reference to what we'd like to call an inappropriate culture of spending. This is the culture within the business. The culture is the way that things happen and the way that many people are drawn into a pattern. And we feel that the effect of drawing in, the way he drew in and involved many employees, for example, at meals, involving them in the payment process, listing them on the receipts. This was one of the reasons why this became a culture, because several people, more than one, were drawn into these activities. And the activities that perpetrated this culture of spending were the following. Okay, they include the following. These are the significant areas that we came across. And please just bear with me. There's 2 pages of these. I've just summarized for you. The former CAO's remuneration and expense reimbursements were significantly higher than his peers in similar roles. So we see that from the invoices we've seen, the work we've done, but also from the SOFI reports. Secondly, frequent and excessive levels of spending on meals and entertainment. Expenses reimbursed with no approvals and lack of scrutiny in the approval process. Number 4, improper splitting of expenses or directing subordinates to pay and claim reimbursement for these expenses. 5, meal expenses above meals thresholds as prescribed in policies and bylaws. Again, these are all anomalies, things that don't follow a normal pattern. Number 6, submitting expense claims without adequate support, such as itemized or legible receipts. 7, purchase and distribution of gift cards and items of a personal nature without specifying who the recipients were and the reason for it. You know, was it a Christmas, birthday, 15 years service? And number 8, the former CAO appears to have created or encouraged a culture of bypassing financial internal controls in respect of these expense claims. I just want to add to that there, number 8. What's more concerning to me is that the CAO's position is one of tone at the top that everybody should be following. And he did very little to correct these gaps in these internal controls. We see very little improvements to policies and procedures during his tenure. Number 9, lack of controls in the finance department. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the recommendations. Lack of board oversight and governance. Lack of mandated vacation. Decrease the opportunity for identifying issues. Yeah, I mean, that's talking about forced vacation, making sure everybody takes their vacation, they all need the rest, but also vacation is a key discovery period where wrongdoing quite often in our line of work is uncovered when people take vacations. And of course, in the former CEO's example, we see him being paid out for not taking vacation. So this, of course, is a recommendation. It will come through in the recommendations. Number 12, the former CEO did not take reasonable steps to improve the governance process, as I think I've just mentioned. 13, the rectification of these cultural activities was not supported by the HR department. So there's a couple of things there. We did see several examples whereby we had to question the closeness of the relationship between the former CEO, CAO, and also the manager of HR. There were certain things that we noticed which were happening quite easily. There were certain things that weren't happening. So the getting overtime paid, maybe his performance review process. So, you know, we have to have segregation of duties and distance and control over these relationships going forward. The rectification of these cultural issues was not supported by HR. Sorry, that's done. Recommended changes by the TNRD staff were not considered in certain circumstances. 15, policies and bylaws. We're going to see that in the recommendations. We certainly found deficiencies with regard to meals and entertaining, and to a certain extent, conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest is quite well covered in the Code of Conduct, but there are rooms for improvement. Number 16, procurement activities, comparing contracts to invoice amounts and obtaining approvals. We saw in the vendor review, we saw significant areas of improvements that are required and recommended. And then 17, expenses, I think kind of duplicating what we've already seen, frequent and expensive meals, expenses not supported by itemized receipts, former CAO claimed meals in excess of per diem allowance, former CAO directed other attendees to charge meals on their corporate credit cards. There was a practice of writing names on the receipts of attendees who themselves actually advised us that some of them were not actually present. So false listing. Practice of writing charges to the GL instead of listing individuals' names. All anomalies and rather unusual. So now I'd like to summarize the recommendations, and I've grouped these into 5 key areas. And there will be a recommendations report released shortly over the next few days. First of all, I want to talk about it grouped into corporate governance activities and oversight. Then we'll look at policies and bylaws. Then we'll look at human resources, internal audit, and finance department review. So we've got 5 areas to summarize these into. So first of all, in terms of what we would call oversight, and this is the oversight of corporate governance, the high-level view. We do feel that there are some shortcomings at the board level. And, you know, our point is to be very constructive and offer recommendations here rather than be too critical. But we would recommend governance, ethics and fraud awareness training, at least on an annual basis to all board members and particularly new members. We would also, I'm pretty sure the constitution of the board, there's some fantastic skills. I would just want to be sure that there are financial skills on the, I'm not saying there aren't, financial skills and governance skills on the board. And I think more importantly, we'd like to see the board delegate more to its audit committee. The audit committee is a subcommittee of the board. And as such, we feel that the audit committee can do more to help the board control the governance in the organization. So for example, the audit committee, we know, spends a lot of its time with the external auditors, monitoring what they do, the review process. We do feel that if the audit committee had a charter, which is usual, the charter is the mandate of what its roles and responsibilities are, who it reports to. Obviously, it reports to the board, but also how it carries out its work. So what we're actually talking about there is giving the audit committee some, making sure it's got access to resources. That's not just financial, but also an auditor or a team of auditors, but certainly an auditor who can be in the business doing all these reviews, checking compliance with the policies, updating the policies, making recommendations. We do feel that as though the audit committee can do a lot more here. Of course, audit committees do outsource this work. And I think to a certain extent they have used your external auditors to do this, but it's always good to have an independent internal audit function from the external function. Yeah, the audit committee needs capacity or needs somebody to be doing this work. An internal audit body would be a good thing. Also, in their control and review of the external audits function, we would recommend that the internal audits looks at the rotation of audit partners or audit firms. You know, I mean, this comes up for renew every 5 years. That's fine, but maybe a review of that process. You know, we don't want to be really getting into the external audit, so we're actually trying to control the external audit function by the internal audit committee charter here. And it's good for the audit committee to, when they're looking at external audit, to ask for external audit quality feedback as well, to make sure that they are doing the right amount of tests on the control environment and things like that. And then third bullet point, so this all talks of the zero tolerance tone at the top. The tone at the top for a zero tolerance towards breaches of the rules, towards misappropriation or excessive spending. We like to term this as zero tolerance. That's what we need to be aiming for. And zero tolerance is more than just writing on a page. We do recommend that the CAO and the board, that they regularly publish things, articles, they regularly are on news radio reports, but they're always talking to the public about zero tolerance to try and get the message out there. That also goes for the CAO position. The CAO is an oversight position in terms of governance, and there's a lot of responsibilities with that position for a zero tolerance approach, which obviously we have not seen. The fourth bullet point, fraud risk assessment, is very much about corporate governance, particularly relating to fraud. This is a total review of the organisation in terms of its vulnerabilities in all the different areas to fraud risk, and have a plan through a fraud register to manage those risks. All those risks are cascaded down to the procurement manager, the sales manager, the CAO, the HR people. It all filters into their key performance indicators, and over time, fraud risk reduces. That's the objective. So an annual fraud risk assessment is something that we would consider the TNRD really thinks about. I can just move on now because time's going. Policies and bylaws. Let's look at that for a couple of minutes. So the code of conduct is a pretty good document. It's got a lot of stuff in there. We would make some recommendations, however, with regard to the code of conduct. In terms of, it does talk about speaking and whistleblowing very broadly. If you've got a concern, you want to talk to somebody, speak to your manager. We would recommend that be enhanced into a formalized whistleblowing process that ideally should be an external channel. I do believe that your current CAO has been working on this, and there have been certain improvements made. But whistleblowing, according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, is the best way, the number one way of discovering and also deterring fraud. They do surveys every couple of years. So code of conduct, we call it whistleblowing. It also refers to conflicts of interest, and it's got an annual declaration to be signed, but we see no declaration for gifts. We would recommend a gift declaration of gifts received and given. And, you know, just generally speaking, the code of conduct needs a review, as all your policies do, every year at least. And in the event that you see something that triggers that it needs something else adding. When you're talking about conflicts of interest, for example, these should include family members. That doesn't seem to be in there. And approvals and authorization, basically in your policies relating to entertainment and gifts and the bylaws, we do see these gaps in terms of requiring receipts, lists of names of people are there, and everything we've discussed. So our general comment here is that an annual review of policies and procedures and the code of conduct should be performed. A couple of other points: human resources. We think you should have a review of your performance review process in terms of the CAO's performance reviews. We've seen some activities in this area, but of course, nothing identified some of the things that we've been through in the last 30 minutes. We'd also recommend compensation benchmarking. We found it quite useful to do something as simple as compared to the SOFI reports. We think that HR would play a valuable role in doing something like that. We feel that exit interviews would have highlighted some of the issues that we've discussed, particularly amongst some of the individuals who have been let go or have left under unusual circumstances. It's always very valuable to talk to these people. And we feel that that would have drawn attention to some of these things that have been happening. Whistleblowing, I have already mentioned. Whistleblowing programs can kind of be managed by the Human Resources Department. But as I said, the characteristics of a successful whistleblowing program are A, that it's external, B, that it offers anonymity, C, that it's highly confidential, and sometimes that the calling is free phone. Some people like that, but I think nowadays we like to see access to whistleblowing through email and also online reporting. And then we've got training within HR. We feel, I've mentioned before, we feel that ethics and governance training, maybe let's extend that into fraud training, but certainly governance training throughout the organization, particularly at management level. And the reason why it's in HR is because quite often the HR control the training programs, and they can roll them out and keep an eye on who's had the training, who's short of training this year. But certainly at board level and CAO level, we do want to see some training. Internal audits, very significant recommendation. This we do appreciate that internal audit will cost you money. Just for one internal auditor, there will be a cost, but we see if this had have happened over the last X years, an internal auditor would have stumbled across this and seen it and saved you guys an awful lot of money. So that's going to come about by including the charter, by a charter and the internal audit committee, which will properly define an internal auditor's role. And don't get me wrong, you don't have to have an internal auditor on the payroll. A lot of organizations do outsource it. That is an option. But you do need resources. You do need the money and the individuals to do this. And then finally, in the recommendations, the finance, we just want to touch on the finance department. The finance department is crucial to, the finance department is your gatekeeper in terms of your money. And as we saw earlier with the circle, I identified a couple of problem areas. Then I identified that the CFO and CAO were very close to the approvals process, which had broken down. So we would make some recommendations with regard to the finance department, and those would include these. Let's relook at the duties and responsibilities of the CFO position, not really talking about an individual, but the position. The internal controls surrounding finance. There are many internal controls, like your bank reconciliations, your ledger reconciliations, reconciling the general ledger to all the sub-ledgers. These all have to be checked, and this all ties in with the recommendation on the audit committee and having an auditor. So our recommendation is that the auditors, one of the auditor's primary roles is the internal controls relating to the finance department and checking that those reconciliations are all being done, checking that a good sample of expenses are all being approved correctly. And of course, the third recommendation under finance is compliance with the bylaws and the policies. The internal audit role would check compliance and also rate recommendations on an ongoing basis if those policies and procedures need to be enhanced. So you can see we're not laying so much blame in particular areas, but we are recommending the exertion of control surrounding those areas. And in my mind, the internal audit function under the internal audit committee is crucial to many of these recommendations. So, Merry Christmas to everybody. I think Jervis will close.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for the summary of those observations, findings, and recommendations. And I do want to close on a positive note. I am sure for all of you members of the board and for others participating, this has not been a fun exercise by any stretch or any imagination, and it's taken a long period of time. There are a number of recommendations that we've outlined in our report, and I really think there's a unique opportunity for TNRD to really move forward on a very positive basis. You've got new leadership at the top. You've got new in-house counsel, and I believe you've got a unique opportunity to see some of these recommendations, and both as senior management, but also the board need to grab a hold of these recommendations and start to systematically implement change. Some of these things have already been addressed. I know Mr. Hildebrand, Ms. Campbell, others have started to make some progress in certain areas, but I think you really need to take an inventory of all of these recommendations and say to yourselves, what can we put into action over the next 3 months, over the next 6 months, and you know, there's a lot here. Simon summarized them in terms of 5 or 6 different themes, but there's probably 15 or 20 recommendations that need to get addressed by TNRD. I think the tone at the top's there. I believe the board is very interested in moving forward on a positive basis. And I think the biggest opportunity is for the board to take control of this situation, take ownership of the key recommendations, and ensure that with the help of the senior management, the executive at TNRD, these are all actioned upon going forward. With that summary, I would like to thank TNRD, in particular, Mr. Hildebrand and Deanna Campbell and Katie Soltis and others who have been very instrumental in supporting our review. They've clearly acted in a very independent and objective manner in terms of working with us. Having said that, they've had to be supportive in terms of sharing with information with us, which they've done incredibly well. And when I talked about the hours and hours that BDO has spent on this investigation and review, I neglected in my introductory comments to comment about the number of hours that have been spent by TNRD, by senior management, and many of the staff at TNRD. So I do want to thank the group over there for their support and their level of effort and collaboration with us. And I will also take this opportunity to wish each and every one of you the best of the season. I do agree it would be nice to put this behind you and move forward into 2022. And I believe the best way to do that is to start to action some of the recommendations moving forward. So with that, Mr. Chair, Mr. Gillis, I'll turn the mic back over to you, and we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you ever so much for that. Thank you for both gentlemen for your presentation. And thank you for mentioning the fact that many of your recommendations have in fact already been, if not implemented, at least acted upon, and they're in the process of being implemented. We appreciate the time you spent, and we look forward to hearing the final analysis there, the final recommendations to which Simon referred. So again, thank you. We have an addendum to the report, so we'll let the BDO folks out before that begins, and Mr. Hildebrand will present that when IT tells me that it's okay to proceed.
All right, we will leave your meeting at this point in time then, Mr. Gillis.
Thank you so kindly.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great, I think we're good to go. Yep. Just one further addendum that I needed to share. BDO Canada discovered that they had a conflict of interest with a business in relation to the forensic audit. Allegations with respect to this business were identified, and BDO was not able to investigate these matters. For this reason, and following their own internal protocols, they passed this along to the TNRD to action. Concerns were raised about the amount of money being spent at this establishment as opposed to other suppliers. Allegations also included preferential business being awarded, personal relationships, and other concerns. While this information cannot be included in the forensic audit report by BDO Canada, staff are highlighting the allegations and information in a separate summary report. Myself and Ms. Campbell looked into these allegations and will be providing subsequent information. The purpose of this addendum or these comments is not to draw any conclusions, but to only provide the allegations and information with respect to this business. The TNRD is not in a position to make findings of fact as a forensic audit would. This information is only intended to present and highlight the concerns in the interest of accountability and transparency and maintaining TNRD's commitment to looking into all allegations brought forward by staff. This information will also be made available at the same time as the BDO report in the very near future. That's all I have to say. Thank you.